Welcome, everyone, friends of the Ackland, and I get the feeling that many of you are personal friends of Sheldon Peck's, which is lovely. So nice of you to be here this afternoon. I'm Katie Ziegler, the director of the Ackland Art Museum, and I want to start off by telling you all a thrilling story, which is that last November, Peter Nisbet and I received a phone call from Sheldon and Lena Peck, and it was literally the most exciting phone call of my entire professional career. He said that he and Lena had been thinking of what to do with their extraordinary collection of 16th and 17th century Dutch and Flemish drawings. They'd been courted by many museums and had decided that in this age, when high-resolution digital images can be seen on the internet any time of day, any place in the world, they would like to give their collection to the museum where it would have the greatest impact. And that museum is the Ackland. So we are over the moon about this. It, in one fell swoop, has made us a great leading center of Northern European drawings and works on paper in the world. Most exciting. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sheldon this afternoon to talk about his journey in collecting. And I can guarantee you that it's going to be a mesmerizing talk. He's most erudite and experienced, and he's also very entertaining. So please welcome Sheldon Peck.
I'm here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. That's the kind of introduction that I sort of appreciate but loathe also, because now the expectation is, the bar is a bit too high, but we'll try to meet it, as I did when I was a student here. We had the good fortune almost 20 years ago to really activate my reconnection with my alma mater, UNC, by cooperating in a wonderful show, as it were, of landscape drawings from the golden age of Holland, the Netherlands' great age, the 17th century. We had been collecting for 20-some-odd years, and we're excited that many of these drawings, over half, had never been exhibited before. Some of them actually were discoveries that we made through a very intense, labored, but enjoyed process of visual observation and scholarly work. And this was a traveling exhibition, and it started really our relationship, our deeper relationship with the Ackland, culminating with 3 months ago, the formal announcement that our collection would be residing here. And it's really been a blessing. Lena and I and our daughter Anya and son Mark are very proud that the collection is in a place where it will be in perpetuity appreciated and exalted, if you will, and it will be a central point from which the world can access it if they want. So today, I appreciate being invited back by my friends here to give a talk, and every time I give it, it's a little different, and I'm not quite sure how different it will be because it depends what I say, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say. But it's going to talk about our journey in finding these drawings that were really produced 300 to 400 years ago as incidental parts of these great artists' lives, as recording an initial thought, exercising their imagination, dawdling pleasurably, but using their supreme intellect and their powers of observation of nature to put on paper some marvelous images that, quite frankly, can hardly be reproduced today by even the greatest artists. And also with this, give you an introduction of the dynamics, the power and depth of what's called the Peck collection at the Ackland Art Museum. We're very proud of it. And we know these works sort of as children, not at the level that we have raised you, Anya, but children as part of our greater family. First, let's talk about the senses, the five senses. Aristotle was the first one to formulate some kind of ranking, the Aristotelian ranking of our senses. He wrote this in Metaphysics, Book 1, during the Golden Age, the 4th century of Greece. And he said, by our very nature, we desire to know. We delight in this through our senses. Above all others is the sense of sight, vision. We prefer seeing to everything else, and we learn the most from seeing. So nothing has changed since that observation over 2,000 years ago. Our eyes really are our guides. And any institute of visual learning, visual arts, such as the Ackland, really is a preeminent place to exercise our preeminent sense. And yet tricks can be played with our eyes. We immediately see this as a bespectacled man or a woman, a rough drawing of a fit person's face. However, our brain can be changed with a mere shift, and the left brain can call the right brain a liar. The left brain is our language center sense. Our right brain controls image perception. And there is hemispheric preemption that can take place, and probably took place immediately with this 45-degree shift in some of your minds. Visual decoding ability is highly variable among people, among artists, and among perceivers of art. It depends on brain wiring, which for each of us is different, conditioning, again, for each of us is different, and visual memory, and we all have different patterns of memory. Some people remember language, can recite poetry, but can't remember whether they've seen a picture before. So these are some of the variables. There's an old axiom in art that says, if you're a right-handed artist, try not to get a left-handed critic, and vice versa, because the critic is not going to quite see things the way you saw them when you laid them down on paper or canvas. A few years ago, I saw this cover photo of a magazine, Dentistry Today, and immediately my mind said, I've seen this image before. I got that deja vu feeling. And it didn't take long for me to conjure in my mind what I was thinking about. This grand oil on board portrait of Toulouse-Lautrec's friend, Dr. Jules Zemine Payan, during a mouth operation. And that's what a trained and adept visual person would tend to do. These are the kinds of people who are good at reading and remembering maps. Some of us are better than others. And it was this image at the Clark Museum that came to mind when I saw Dentistry Today. People with this quality of visual memory usually turn out to be successful surgeons, dentists, architects, art connoisseurs, and others where visualization makes a difference. And yet, with this particular aptitude, mistakes can be made. We can see a portion of what we think is one of the Sunflowers masterpieces by Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as we anglicize it, and say, aha, this is another great painting. I think someone in Japan ought to buy it. And indeed they did. And questions were raised, and it could well be a paint-by-numbers knockoff. So it's buyer beware in the art market. There's some very good and competent, visually competent people who are out there making copies, not just contemporaneously now, but during the time that the art was originally made. These are just a handful of books that have been produced about genuine and false copies, imitations, and forgeries. The one that strikes me as the most humorous is Eric Hebron's book, The Art Forger's Handbook, which he wrote, and it's a wonderful book. He wrote while he was serving time in prison for art forgery. A very industrious fellow. So years ago, decades ago, my late brother and I decided the Dutch and Flemish Old Master drawings and paintings were what we'd focus on. This is after a foray into American contemporary art, large canvases, large pieces, works on paper. We wanted something that had more scholarly bite, that really required us to go to books, to retain some memory of images, to do comparatives, to do detective work. This image you see here is a Rembrandt landscape. It's a marvelous Rembrandt landscape. It is almost unique. There are 4 others that Rembrandt did using wash or brush as part of the development of the composition. The background is done in brush, which is rare for Rembrandt. You can see a bit of a cityscape of Amsterdam here. This pointer doesn't show, but that's okay. And some farm buildings. It's marvelous, and if you want to see it, it will come up in one of the many exhibitions at the Ackland soon, I'm sure. This is Harvey, my late brother, and myself when we started our collecting interests, using some of the same skills that we used in orthodontics, in a highly detailed work and visualization. And Lena and I continued after Harvey's untimely death in the early 1980s. And so the collection has really taken 40 years, a bit more than 40 years of gestation. What I want to go through with you now is a little bit of the wherewithal of how to become a good art detective. And it just doesn't relate to drawings, old drawings, but it relates to any analysis of substantive art, of figurative art, of art done by artists when art was really something of a medium that you incorporated your masterful eye-hand coordination with your masterful creativity and your masterful imagination. We'll start, as at any good educational institution, with a little tutorial. These are 2 drawings, or segments, details of 2 drawings, of a woman with a child. And they're done at the same period of time. They're both 17th century drawings. And we want to find out something about quality. Which one is actually of better quality than the other? You noticed on the drawing on your left, done in what seems to be the brown ink, has a scattered sense of line. The artist wasn't too sure about the placement of the lines. Some of the hatchings, some of the shadows are inconsistent. There are no really strong, confident lines of the outline. The size of the child in this woman's hand indicates she is either a bodybuilder or the artist did not size that child correctly. Whereas on your right, we see an image of a woman who is literally dragging a toddler along. He's reluctant, and the anatomy and the posture of these 2 seem absolutely balanced and right for the kind of push-pull that you can imagine in the relationships. There are in the drapery or clothing, the gown that the woman's wearing, some very confident, quick strokes, wonderful lines without hesitation. The artist had a mind's eye sense of this image. He didn't have to sketch in an underdrawing, a light a light representation as the artist on the left. You can see detail in the faces. You can see that the woman who's a nursemaid, is in contemplation, and the boy is sort of just being pulled along. We don't worry about the smudge that's at the bottom. We don't worry about those kinds of things that are part of the process, that the bruising that takes place over 300 or 400 years of preservation. But there's no question that the quality and consistency and clarity of the drawing on the right is far superior to that which we would see the drawing on the left. We can tell with the drawing on the right where the sun's coming from. It's coming from her left side because the shadows are on the right. There's no sense of accent in lines on the left drawing that tells us what's happening or where the light is coming from. So, with that stylistic and very precise analysis of how the artist laid down these drawings, it's not hard to realize and determine that the great drawing is the one on the right. It's Rembrandt, 1640, Studies of a Woman and Two Children. It's the same woman, and the woman's in another contemplative pose, holding a baby who is wrapped, swaddled in a jacket. And Rembrandt thought this was so humorous or so interesting as he saw these people in life on the street that he wrote a commentary, one of his few annotated drawings, in Dutch, of course, a young child with an old jacket over his head. And on top is the remnants of a third study that you see the elbows of this woman, which he probably didn't like, so he cut the paper and he put in these the knees of the sitting woman just by having dry ink on his finger and rubbed it right in. So this is a masterpiece from 1640 by Rembrandt, which is, of course, now at the Ackland. So you've seen a comparison. Don't buy the drawing on the left. You'll have trouble with it later on. It will be a sore in you'll dream, have nightmares about it. So another aspect of using a discriminating eye is this drawing. This drawing came to market in 2001 at Sotheby's in New York, and it was, as these auction houses very carefully do, it was entitled Attributed to Rembrandt, a study of a market woman, a woman who is coming or going to a market. And what we see here is immediately of the facial form, the physiognomy of an African woman. She has the kind of physiognomy that we associate with African facial form. And you also notice under her left arm, she has a mitt on her hand, and she's holding a chicken. That's the head of a chicken, held by her mitted hand, and you see the tail feathers sticking out at the back. And if we go to what auction houses and what dealers and others use as hierarchy of certainty, this is a little digression I want to give you a sense of. When they say something is by Rembrandt van Rijn, that means they are sure that they've consulted with a lot of scholars, and definitely everyone says this is a work by Rembrandt, whether it's a painting, etching, or drawing. Now, if it says attributed to Rembrandt van Rijn, they want to couch their legal responsibility, and they say, well, you know, a lot of people say it's by Rembrandt, but there's one kooky guy who thinks it's not. It's by a student, so we can't say it's directly or fully by Rembrandt. It's attributed to, buyer beware. Studio of Rembrandt says, well, not too many people are saying it's by Rembrandt. It's Rembrandtesque 150 years ago. It was considered by Rembrandt, and we think it's by one of his students. Rembrandt had 45 or so pupils, and they all tried to imitate the master. And some of them did very well, and for hundreds of years, some of their works were considered Rembrandt's. Circle of Rembrandt van Rijn, well, didn't study with Rembrandt. They think they're good artists. They lived in the neighborhood. They saw some of his work. They copied it. They didn't put their name on it. They thought they'd get a higher price if someone thought it was by Rembrandt. But they lived during the same time. Manner of Rembrandt van Rijn is somebody, perhaps after Rembrandt died, who loved Rembrandt's work, saw the prices were going up. Artist was not doing well selling things with his own name, so he tried to copy Rembrandt. And some of them, for 100 or so years, got by. And then there's after Rembrandt in this hierarchy of certainty or authenticity. And you have to really beware of that category, because even I could have done it. Anybody, any period of time, it's a copy of a known work by the master. So these are things, if you get serious in the art world, whether you're dealing with dealers or auction houses, you have to know their code words, and these are the code words, the legal code words. So this work was entitled Attributed to Rembrandt, which means in some compilations it was considered Rembrandt, but there has been some doubt. So that's just the kind of situation we love to study and get to the truth, get to the facts. In medicine and dentistry, we're evidence-based, and we collect evidence, real objectified evidence. So we see this wonderfully confident drawing. It's a small drawing, 3 by 3 inches. And we focus on, why did Rembrandt do it? You know, he might have been in the marketplace and saw this woman, but there were a number of West African men and women coming into the Netherlands, freed. They were not slaves, and the women largely worked as in domestic jobs, and the men worked in militia companies. And I think he was attracted to the hair cover, a very bright West African hair cover that this woman had, and she had it attached or held in place by 2 clips that you see here that Rembrandt delineated very exactly, 2 probably ivory clips on either side of her ear. And that might have been the attraction of why he wanted to record her image, not simply the idea of carrying a chicken under her arm, a hen. So there are comparatives we make, similar new immigrants to Amsterdam. Here's one of a militia boy, and here's another militia boy. And we see the same kind of stylistic handling of facial features and form. After analyzing that and the collector's mark, the VH, the Van Hecken collector's mark, and the paper, we rather exactly concluded that this was by Rembrandt in 1633-35. It's been verified by some of the scholars that we trust, and so this is something we added to the collection very proudly. We gave it its identity again after 300 years. What do you need to identify the artist's hand? Well, you need a good library for this kind of stuff. It isn't simply an aesthetic taste, or the background of this painting matches the decor of our room. We had about 5,000 books on Northern European Baroque art, and reveled whenever an auction catalog came out. We'd go to our library and looking for comparatives and looking for watermark analysis. Books, catalogs, art. We tried to study old European art with an artist's eye and attention to details. That's very important. The next thing that you have to be adept at, or at least know something about, is technical analysis. You have to analyze or be able to appreciate the differences in artist materials and the known facts about the drawings. There are techniques now in science, non-invasive techniques for ink and chalk analysis, such as spectroscopy and reflectography, to find out whether ink used at one segment, ink or pigment in one segment of the work, is the same as another segment, to rule out the idea that there have been additions or doctorings of the work. You can do paper analysis using radiographic analysis of watermarks, using some of the same X-ray equipment that are found in dental offices, and other known facts such as collector's marks and the provenance associated with the work. This is an industrial machine giving a low-energy Grens X radiography to record the watermarks and structure of the paper, and this is what we get when we put paper through this analysis, we can actually see the watermark beautifully, much better than transillumination by holding it up to light. And these are two watermarks that are very common in 17th century European paper. One thing to keep in mind is that a Rembrandt work on paper would never be done on 18th century paper. The man was in his grave in 1669. So paper made in 1670 or 1770 would not really be something that Rembrandt would have worked with. A lot of museums have been embarrassed because they go through their etchings collections and they find, doing this new watermark analysis, that some of the etchings they've considered as Rembrandts, struck by Rembrandt, are not struck by Rembrandt. They're after strikes, posthumous strikes. And then there's stylistic analysis and stroke analysis. And to keep it simple for you people without getting you too bogged down with all the details, any unsure, unsteady work on paper, unsteady lines, usually is the line of a copyist. The great artists were very bold in their visual conceptions. And when they put pen or chalk or whatever medium they were using to paper, you saw one of these great Matisse lines in his line drawings, or one of the great confident lines of Rembrandt. They had this organized in their head. There are no incongruities. And with copyists, there are more pen-up moments, strokes of shorter length, and just an increase in what we call neuromotor noise, the signal-to-noise ratio. The man who really started the technical analysis, the father of quantitative and qualitative content analysis in the old masters, was a fellow named Giovanni Morelli. Morelli was from Padua. He was a physician by training and an art lover by nature. And he was disrespected throughout his entire life by the curators of the big museums all over Europe because they felt he didn't go through the regular way of becoming a museum expert. He was using facts, and this is an etching of Morelli in his study room in Padua in the mid-1800s. Morelli finally published his work. He largely worked with the Italian masters. He published them during his life under a pseudonym, and it was published posthumously. And his idea was the commonplace, basic morphologic details of a portrait: the eyes, hands, nose, ears. These would be done according to the graphic style, the peculiar graphic style of the artist, not by virtue of the sitter. He put it all together for resemblance to the sitter, but yet, you know, Bellini does his hands a certain way, and Parmigianino does his ears a certain way. And through looking at these incidental features of portraits, you can actually get a sense of authenticity, that those are Parmigianino's ears and hands, so it's not Bellini. And he was right on target for most of his pronouncements, and the museum people didn't like it. We can use stylistic analysis to discriminate visually. Some artists prefer chalk, some artists prefer paint, some artists preferred ink. Some artists put underdrawings of chalk down and then filled it in with ink. Painters, some preferred reddish hues, others didn't. Rembrandt hardly used red in his painting oeuvre. Some of his students did. Subject matter, some artists like landscapes, others portraits. Compositional structure, you can talk about the landscape mode versus the vertical mode, and the way compositions are laid out. Modeling of figures and faces. There are certain artist preferences. The treatment of space and light, how good an artist is in a consistency of showing where light is coming from with their shadows. And comparison with secure works, works that are signed, works that are known, works that have preparatory drawings to back them up. This is a drawing that we bought a number of years ago. It's a sheepfold, a hut in the woods for shepherds to put their sheep during a storm or what have you. And it was sold as somewhat attributed to Adrian van der Velde. This is the great painting of the hut by Adrian van der Velde, the great landscapist who died at age 36. This is in the Rijksmuseum. And it is now well known that our drawing, the one in the Ackland, I should say, Katie, I've got to get used to saying your drawing, not our drawing. It's a blind spot. That the Ackland drawing is the preparatory drawing for the sheep hut in the forest. And the Rijksmuseum wants this terribly, Katie, but no. It's got to stay here. And, sometimes the working out the idea, you could see some differences. The placement of there's a dog in the preparatory drawing that doesn't show up in this place. The dog shows up. There are a couple of other preparatory drawings of some of the figures, but not of the sheep hut. But in a way, the preparatory drawing gives us more joy to see the artist work out his ideas than the formalized painting. There was an exhibition at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London a few months ago, and this drawing and the painting were reunited for the first time in 350 years. Lena and I love to visit the print rooms of various great museums in Europe. And when we were at the Statens Kunstmuseum in Copenhagen a decade or so ago, we came across, and they'll let you sit there with the boxes of drawings. You say you want to see the Dutch 17th century, and they bring out 3 boxes, and you're there on your own, and you have your own little exhibition going. No food allowed, but we would have had cookies and stuff if they allowed it. So we saw this drawing and said, my God, that's almost like one that's in our collection, except ours is reversed. So with the power of computers, we can reverse this and see these hunters. It's a winter scene. You can see by the lack of foliage, and hunters and skaters are on ice. And there's some buildings in the back and a church steeple. And this is a comparative of the one that's now at Ackland. And the one we saw, they only could give us a black and white print of it. And you can see the one that's at Ackland is much more detailed. And there's much more solidity to the figures. Look at the figures skating in the back. They're much more vital. The houses, the reticulated houses, are done with much more understanding than the one at the Copenhagen Museum. And so we noticed the back of the Copenhagen Museum, it had the marks, the ownership marks of a fellow named Ploos van Amstel. Ploos van Amstel was a dealer artist in the late 18th century in Holland who made capital by collecting drawings and then putting them in the camera obscura, and they would be projected upside down and backwards, and then he traced them and then sell them, as copies. Well, not really copies, but he would actually put AVE, Allard van Everdingen, on them, and he would sell them. People had no resource to doubt him. And this was one that was sold and then made its way through collections into the Copenhagen Museum. So the one at the Ackland is the original, and the one in Copenhagen is the 18th century copy. Lena and I were elated to make that discovery, immediately shared it with the people at the Kunstmuseum, and somehow we never heard back from them. That has happened a few times where we have come up with one great discovery that they have a verifiable copy, and communication was cut off. So in this list of needing things to identify the artist's hand, a second opinion is often good. We used to go to, quote, experts often early in our career, but then we decided, we'll trust ourselves and our due diligence. And then you need a little bit of luck. So with this background, I think I think you are all ready to be inserted into the auction room. Make sure, they do take cash there, so make sure your pockets are full. And this is a sale that took place 20 years ago, that Lena and I were in Amsterdam attending the viewing. And we noticed, the catalog is helpful, but we noticed on the wall this very charming landscape. And it said, Circle of Jacob van Roosdael. Okay, you know the hierarchy of certainty. That's not a good category at all. A lot of museum people immediately wouldn't even look at it because, you know, they're taking something risky. They have to go through all the wherewithal to identify it, identify some certainty, to convince a board of trustees or a department board. They don't want any part of it. So it's somebody like me who could, and Lena, who can go out there and do the work and find out whether it's worthwhile. But from a visual point of view, we were very attracted. So they say it's Circle of Jacob van Roosdael. They put a name to it. You know, with these old works, the artists never named them. You can name them whatever you want. I could say it's several ducks by an estuary quacking in the morning, and that'd be fine. So here it is, in a frame that we found out had not been opened for, could be 100 years. And we had the temerity to go to the Sotheby's head and say, can we take this into a room and let's open the frame, we want to examine the paper. Sure. Opened the frame, and 100 bugs fell out the back. I loved it. It means that it has been preserved like a tomb. Nobody has bothered to look at it. They took the pictures for the catalog through the glass. It has this spotted nature, which is foxing. It's a mold, a mildew that develops over the years in some works that have been in high humidity. And in a chalk drawing like this, it can be removed without too much problem. Jacob van Roosdael was arguably the greatest landscapist of the Dutch Golden Age. What he could do with light was amazing in his paintings, his drawings, his etchings. He was remarkable. There were a number of Roosdaels, but Jacob van Roosdael was preeminent. There are only about 130 drawings known by Jacob van Roosdael and about 150 paintings. So we took this in the back room. The insects fell out. We examined the paper. And what we wanted to know is, what is this construction, this wooden construction in the front? Nobody mentioned that. And so that was before we took cell phone photos. So I had to store this. I made a drawing of it myself. We had the catalog drawing. We made a sketch of the watermark on the paper. And we went to the Rijksprintencabinet Library the next day. This was in Amsterdam. And found that Esaias van der Velde did a drawing of a similar aqueduct going into a brewery. That was a construction, a wooden construction that hoisted water, clean water, into a brewery or into an inn. And they were all over, used all over in the 17th century in Holland. So that identified the structure. We also know that Jacob van Roosdael loved wooden constructions. He was a sidewalk superintendent. This is a drawing in the Metropolitan Museum of a mud mill dredging mud to make canals, a drawing by Jacob van Roosdael during the 1650s. So it's the same kind of interest. Remember, picking subject matter. Every artist was different. We analyzed the paper watermark, and this is an X-ray radiograph of the paper watermark. I had a sketch of it. It's a Paschal lamb with a flag surmounted by a crown. And in Haywood, one of the great compilations of 17th century watermarks, we found the same watermark in paper, made in France and sold in Holland from 1648 to 51. There was an embargo of French paper during the 30 Years' War. And then when the Peace of Westphalia came, solving that standoff in 1648, French goods came into Holland. And so this identifies that the drawing was made on paper, made just precisely at the time when Jacob van Rosdahl was doing these kinds of landscapes from his itinerant wanderings around Holland. We analyzed the composition of this drawing, and it's very powerful. There's a shaft of light coming from, we presume, the east, early morning light, through the canal pathway, and it demarcates the work into a lighted area and a dark shadowed area. The tree in the foreground is handled magnificently. All the details of the aqueduct that we studied, the small canal bridge with the family of three, it's all telltale of Jacob van Rosdahl's interest and his capacity to convey these kinds of village scenes. In the corner is a collector's mark, LG with a crown over it, and a wonderfully detailed and scholarly collector of the last century, Fritz Luck, put together marks of collections. And this LG is in there. It's Louis Degassi. That LG indicates that this was in his drawings collection. Most of his drawings went to museums like the British Museum and the Louvre around 1858. This gives a good sense of heritage, of provenance, of the fact that perhaps in the 19th century this was known as a Jacob van Rosdahl, and it's lost its identity along the way. Here's a Jacob van Rosdahl from the National Art Gallery, and now we're studying the style, the way the foliage of the trees is made. Jacob van Rosdahl had this technique of making attached U's or V's for his foliage, as you can see here in the magnified drawing. In this drawing, we see exactly the same mechanism in the authenticated drawings. So with all this evidence, we're ready to go to the auction room. The estimate of this particular drawing was very low, and we felt some smart guy, someone who's really getting paid to do it, not people who are doing it on a lark like we are, is going to be coming to the same conclusions that we are. So we have to sort of play little games when we're in the auction room. People got to know us, and some dealers, if they saw us raising our hand, they would raise their hand too, just so we wouldn't get whatever we wanted. We'd have to buy it from them. So we left a bid with the front of the room, the auction house, knowing that if it goes higher, we can then insert ourselves as a new bidder. Well, the room was quiet, and lot 128 came, circle of Jacob van Rosdahl, and we were just sitting sort of, poker-faced, just doing crossword puzzles in the back of the room. And we got it, and we got it very reasonably. No one else did the work. And we cleaned off the foxing. It looks as good as new, as if I did it yesterday. We renamed it, according to all the facts we found, to Riverbank with a wooden aqueduct and view of a village. And it's now in the catalogue raisonné of Jacob van Rosdahl. And we're very proud of that. We've given its identity back to it. Now I'd like to share with you in the few remaining minutes some other drawings that we're very proud of. The Ackland, we hope, is very proud of too, and we'll serve it in perpetuity. This is a wonderful study by Rembrandt, an old man with a fur cap. And just by a few flicks of his chalk stick, he put some zigzags in the lining of the hat to indicate that it was fur. And this man is walking with a gloved hand, a walking stick. It's wintertime, obviously. He has many layers of clothes, and yet you can see the exact detail of his anatomy through all those bundled layers. Rembrandt was an amazing, amazing student and observer of anatomy. Everything was right. And he was an amazing observer of detail. If you look at the man's stockings, on his left leg, you can see the pear-shaped tassel of a garter, and on the right leg you see a mended part of his stocking. Now this drawing is the size of a postcard, and yet 50 times larger. It works. A previous owner of this was the King of Poland, August Francis II. And this was the study for the blind man in the most famous of Rembrandt's etchings, the 100 Guilder print, done a year later. This is another great study by Frans van Mieris the Elder. This is on parchment. There are only 36 drawings known by this great fine shoulderer. He did very small paintings, very small works on paper or parchment, but they're all magnificent. There's a very Vermeer quality to this. This is a woman sleeping at a table. You can see the curls of her hair sticking out from her kerchief. It's absolutely exquisite. This is a very tranquil scene. The Dutch revered ruins. That gave them the sense of history. This castle was ruined during their continuous battle with Spain before they got their independence at the turn of the 17th century and became a republic. This is by Hendrik Hondius the Elder, the ruins of the Castle Spangen, which still exist near Rotterdam. This is a lovely scene by Lambert Domer, who was a pupil of Rembrandt's and loved going on, being peripatetic and going on journeys and recording the villages that he saw. An interesting little bit of trivia with this drawing is 2 owners ago, it was in the collection of Vincent van Gogh. And it was sold at his estate auction after his death. This is a wonderful drawing that we purchased a few years ago. There's a humorous side to it. Jacques de Geyn II was a magnificent Dutch artist whose drawing oeuvre is probably more important than his painting oeuvre. And his son, Jacques de Geyn III, also became a great Dutch artist and intellectual. And this is Jacques de Geyn III when he was a boy. And apparently his father was a little disturbed that the boy didn't communicate with his father too well. So he did this drawing of the boy sitting down at a writing desk or maybe scribbling, and he signed the drawing, it's upside down, with his name, but he was trying to encourage his son to write him a letter. And so this was a very valued family drawing, and that's the reason we have it today. It was kept. It was stored with the family and then through some noble collectors in Holland. This is a wonderful drawing by Esaias van de Velde, who was pretty much the father of Northern European landscape. He worked out the details of how a landscape could be constructed. This has on the right side an estuary and then a cliff and then some houses, and you see a shepherd with sheep. But the funny part of this is in the left foreground, you have the reverse of what you would imagine. Usually it's a man waiting for his dog, and now here's a dog waiting for his man to do his business. And the Dutch, these Calvinist Dutch, that's one of the things, the beauties we love about them. They really reveled in everyday life, whether it was a dog peeing in a church or what have you. Albert Cuyp was a master at the landscape and also animals, farm animals particularly. And we love this drawing, which we also bought recently and I think is treasured at the Ackland. A sheep study. These sheep were used in a painting a few years later, but these sheep are pretty much anthropomorphic. It's like you can look at the expressions on their face and they wish they weren't wearing wool costumes. They want to get out of these costumes and become people like the rest of us. It really is amazing how some artists can get it done and see beyond the rest of the masses. And Albert Cuyp was absolutely a genius in his depiction of animals, emotion in animals. This is a marvelous drawing by Willem Schellings. Schellings traveled, did the grand tour of Italy, and in this particular drawing was done when he was shepherding a nobleman's family. And this is one of the great stops, the Grotto of Virgil at Posillipo near Naples. It was legend had it that Virgil was buried in this man-made tunnel that connected Posillipo to Naples, but in fact he wasn't buried there, but it was a stop you had to make. And you can see here in the foreground an artist sketching with a friend, and presumably that's Schellings depicting himself. And the nice thing, one of the nice attributes of this is we have, with this drawing, this large drawing, 18 by 13 inches, we have Schellings' handwritten diary entry of his visit to this grand natural and man-made phenomenon. This is a wonderful Flemish drawing by Jacob Jordens, one of the trilogy of great artists, Rubens, Van Dyck, and Jordens. This is of, we think, his mother-in-law. It's 3-colored chalk, and he was also a master of anatomy. This is on exhibit now at the Ackland, and this is another drawing which we found 10 years later of the same woman. There are actually 4 drawings of her. One's in the Stockholm National Gallery, the other's in the National Gallery of Sweden, and the Ackland has 2, and the 2 best of the 4, I will say. And this is another of the 7 Rembrandts. There are really 8 Rembrandts because one of them is a drawing by Constantine Daniel Renesse, a student of Rembrandt, that Rembrandt didn't like, and he said, okay, Constantine, you elongated the figure too much. You need to cut off the butt right here. You need to put some shadows on the head. And Rembrandt put these bold strokes on this very wimpy drawing. Not wimpy, but it's a great drawing, but not as great as Rembrandt. And you can see the 2 artists sort of vying for space on that drawing. So the Ackland has 7.5 Rembrandts. This is a great Rembrandt because it shows that Rembrandt was not above making changes. Here, he draws a seated man, seated on a chair a little too small for him, leaning into a fire. It must have been a cold day in his hut or home. And Rembrandt felt that the hands, where he originally placed them lower, were a little too low, and he raised the arms and hands up. And he used the whiteout of the day, lead white, to white out his original placement, but that faded over these 350 years, and so we see the pentimenti of the original. And it shows Rembrandt did this quite a bit on his drawings because he was experimenting. He was toying with an idea. But it's a magisterial drawing. The physiognomy, the facial vocabulary is what he was using in the early 1650s. And it's a very large drawing, too. This is a collector's mark, that eye of Nathaniel Hone, a great British collector, that ended his collection in the 18th century. We're very proud that our group, our body of art, has entered Fritz Luth's collector's marks international list, and we have this collector's mark, which is a ligation of all the initials of the family, and they're not on any of the drawings, but we don't want to deface any drawings, but they might eventually, that collector's mark might make it onto the mats. Now, in closing, I'd like to share with you how we think the Peck collection will expand the Ackland's reach. This collection, this 134 drawings, and there may be more coming. You never know what my wife permits, you know. It provides original, rare works from which to teach art enthusiasts, students, artists, powers of seeing and visual discrimination. You really need content to do this. This collection, believe me, is content. This collection will cultivate a strongly embedded sense of quality and taste by providing the best of artistic representations from recognized artists of brilliance and accomplishment. The collection at the Ackland will stimulate, we hope, we feel, new research and collaborations with other great museums and universities. And lastly, but not least, the collection will bring in, we feel, new visitors from around the world to the Ackland and UNC directly or via the internet. We actually feel the internet can and will put the Ackland's access to the Ackland on steroids. And we definitely will look forward to this collection being part of this new internet thrust. There might be people coming from Singapore, Hong Kong, Vienna, all great points in this world, to UNC to visit the Ackland without even knowing we have a basketball team. And you people are privileged to be here already. You don't have to go to RDU or come from RDU. We are so proud that the Ackland's first mini exhibition, and it will be ongoing for years, from the collection are 3 wonderful drawings, each with a different origin in time, space, artists, but they show fully the broad range of this collection, its connection to humanity and brilliance. We commend you to visit it. And we also commend you to enjoy the Ackland, support the Ackland, appreciate the Ackland. Thank you. I'm over time. I'm usually not over time. But do you want to open it up to any easy questions out there? Yes, Carol. By? Oh, Koenig. Yes.
Are you familiar with his work, and have you had that experience of having to make that decision?
Oh, yes, yes. That's Philips Koenig was one of his 45 students. He was a marvelous, Koenig, K-O-N-I-C-K. Oh, Solomon. You sure it's not Solomon Rosdahl? Okay, Solomon Koenig. Yeah, Solomon Koenig was Philips Koenig's brother. He was the little brother in terms of art. So we don't mess with his stuff as much as Philip. Philips studied with Rembrandt. Solomon didn't. But it's very Rembrandtesque and very 17th century and very good work. I wouldn't turn down a Solomon Koenig. Usually it's landscape or biblical scene that he worked in. There are wonderful encyclopedic catalogs that you can go to. Drawings of the Rembrandt School, paintings of the Rembrandt School. There's a fellow in Stuttgart, Werner Samowski, who's still alive at age 99 or 100. Amazing guy, amazing visual sense. He's got a marksman's accuracy in classifying a lot of paintings that have been floating around without any attribution. So you can easily find the whole oeuvre of Solomon Koenig by going to Werner Samowski's Paintings of the Rembrandt School. It's in German, Gemälde der Rembrandt-Schule. Yes? Yeah, that's the same as studio. Well, no. I'm sorry, I take that back. School of is sort of a circle of. It's manner of. Yeah, school of means it's like Rembrandt, but I don't think it's saying that you actually were in his studio. Being in the studio means you were a pupil, but they're not sure which pupil. You could identify, it's interesting, you can identify pupils' works because the pupil usually copies the master at the time they studied. So people with Rembrandt early in his career, when he was doing these quick, energetic sketches, would be doing quick, energetic sketches. But people with Rembrandt, when he was getting frail in his later years, in his 60s, he died when he was 63, had more broad strokes and a little sloppier strokes. And Art de Gelder was one of those. And so you say, well, this is a student, a late student of Rembrandt or an early student of Rembrandt. Yes?
Yes, in Rembrandt scholarship, there was this enormous corpus sort of in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that then under the Dutch project directed at Amsterdam contracted those corpus enormously. And now I think, as I understand it, in the next 20 years or so, we're seeing that re-swell again as scholars announce that a lot of these things were too quickly sort of put aside. I'm curious what you think of that general trend and whether you
Well,
played any role in that.
that's a very erudite question. And I'm sorry to say that you're right, that I agree with the condensation of Rembrandt's oeuvre. 50 years ago, there were 1,600 known drawings by Rembrandt, extant drawings, and there were 650 to 700 known paintings. Today, there are 900 accepted drawings, 1,650 to 900. And from the 700 or so paintings, it's less than 300. Now, if you own one of the 300 paintings, you really don't care. But if you owned one of the 400 that were dropped, you would start writing letters to your congressman. And a lot of museums, such as the Frick with the Polish writer, they protested, and they brought in some scholars saying, you know, we think that Ernst van de Wettering, who headed the latter part of that project, that you're a little too critical, that there are a lot of good things, and Rembrandt tests things about the painting. Between us, I think the commission, the Rembrandt Research Committee, was right. I don't think the Polish writer is quite fitting in. If you look at that horse, it's had plastic surgery. It's had at least 6 inches cut from its midrib. So Rembrandt didn't make those mistakes. He didn't, even on a cold day. So yeah, a lot has been reinserted because the decision to remove it from the oeuvre was not a solid decision. They're using some very scientific methods, such as dendrochronology. They're counting the tree rings, see whether the tree actually was cut at the time or before the painting was made. You know, they can tell from the weather reports, the entire 17th century, just what years the rings were big and not, and they could pretty much tell you when the tree was felled. Good point. Yes.
It seems to me that there were a very large number of very talented painters in a small part of the world in Holland at that time. And do you think that that has something to do with the genetics, with the, you talked at the beginning about the visual, that some people have more visual talent than others?
Well, it's a good try, but I don't think I agree with that. I think it has to do with money. The Dutch in the 17th century ruled the sea. They had maritime supremacy. They had the Dutch East India Company and West India Company. They were the ones who brought lumber from the Baltic and brought it to Spain, so Spain would build ships and bring them up to the Holland and shoot the Dutchman. Anything for money. And that money produced a class of people who became patrons. And you have thousands of patrons who want art, and the artists become alive with income and ambition and incentive. And that incentivized the 17th century. And then when Dutch commerce started declining in the 18th century, the Dutch artists could not muster the same genetics. They couldn't muster the imagination and the talent and the initiative and the resourcefulness to do great original art. They were doing copies of the 17th century. But the Dutch genetically are the tallest people in Europe, so maybe height has something to do with it. Yes?
Have you made a mistake in your collecting? And if so, would you talk about it?
Yes, I am an open book. Early on, we did make mistakes. We made a few mistakes. I've bought things that I thought that were anonymous, Dutch 17th century, and I said, well, easy, I'll figure it out. You know, I'm Sherlock Holmes of Old Master Drawings. I couldn't figure it out, and so I put it back in the market. And usually these things sold. Instead of anonymous, I'd say manner of Herod von Honhorst. Occasionally, one or two times we bought something that actually was attributed, and then in my research afterward I found that it actually was, it wasn't a study for print, it was a copy from a print, which makes it much less desirable. These are a couple of things that we bought from dealers, and it was too late to return it to a dealer, so I put it back in the auction market with the same attribution that I bought it as. And actually, these things sold very well. And there's some collector in Germany who has to figure it out. So, yeah, there are ways of managing this, but anyone who says they haven't made errors that's deceptive. The nice thing is we decided early on we wanted a museum quality collection. So over time, we've sorted this out, and the errors have been very minor and very limited. But the collection the Ackland got are all pristine. There's one work that we bought that actually it had a museum stamp on the back. We thought since Sotheby's was selling it, it's clear, it must have been deaccessioned by the museum. As it turned out, it was stolen during the Second World War. And so we were notified of that 15 years later, and indeed we gave it to Sotheby's. They gave us the original purchase price back, and they returned it. You know, you trust the people you buy it from. Yes? That's a good question. The spectroscopy and reflectography and X-radiography we don't do ourselves. We farm that out to a conservation lab. By the way, the Ackland is one of the few museums that has a full operating high-tech paper conservation lab. So the Ackland is an encyclopedic museum with the kind of laboratory that you dream of. And I'm sure anyone who wants to endow any further equipment, I'm sure Katie will accept that. So yeah, we farm that out. We farm that out. Yes, Joe.
Can you tell the identity of the artist by the ink in some cases? That not just that this ink, does science tell you not only when that ink was available, but are there a variety of inks that
Absolutely. It's a good way. It's the good way to detect a later copy. Anything in sepia, which was an ink that was developed in the 19th century, would not have been used on a 17th century drawing. Most of the inks used in the 17th century were derivatives of ash, wood ash. And so you'd find the same kind of trace elemental analysis that you'd find in wood. And most artists have the same kind of formulation. They didn't grasshopper around. That once they got the same way with their developing of painting pigments, they'd mix their paints the same for every painting. You know, they'd have something that works, and they'd make their own ink too, and apply it the same way. The really super great artists were chameleons. They would be managing anything. Rembrandt could use a toothpick or use whatever you gave him, and he'd produce a brilliant drawing. He used quills for his drawings, or reeds that were cut from reeds and fashioned by the edge of water, or chalk sticks, or silver point, a metallic point. He was amazing. Not all artists were that gifted, but they were consistent. So you can tell a little about the artist. You know, you can figure a Rosedale drawing like the one that we analyzed closely. If it were done in ink, probably not be from the 1648 to 1653 period, because he was using chalk all the time then. He traveled with chalk. He felt chalk was easier to manage. A lot of artists felt chalk was difficult and messy, but for Rosedale, he loved it. So it helps in nailing an attribution. Thank you very much.